Hey, thanks to the Shadow Bookfair in Helsinki for organizing this, and thanks to everyone tuning in. So, my name is Peter. I'm here to talk about nonviolence versus a diversity of tactics. From the very beginning, I want to be clear that when I'm criticizing nonviolence, I'm not criticizing any kind of activity, any form of participation in a social movement that can't be qualified as violent, whatever definition we use for violence. I'm talking about an exclusive approach to social movements that only permit the use of tactics that they define as nonviolent, and those definitions can change, but that to me is not the most important question. And the attempt to exclude or delegitimize all other forms of participation in a social struggle. This is also how proponents of nonviolence tend to conceive of nonviolence. When they're talking about the effectiveness of nonviolence, they're not looking at it in relation with other kinds of participation in social movements. They're looking at it as if it's the only legitimate way to participate in these movements, so excluding everyone else. I'm not terribly interested in debates about, is property destruction violent, is self-defense violent, because I think that it's irrelevant, and I think that it's favoring a term that has never been useful for struggles against capitalism, against the state, against patriarchy, against any form of oppression. Violence has always been the way that those in power have naturalized the state of affairs that benefits them and delegitimized our attempts to resist, to fight back against that state of affairs. So, just according to common sense, or in the street talking with people who might not participate in a social movement, it's a lot easier to convince them that someone who's like masked up and fighting against police or setting fire to a bank is violent, and much harder to convince them that looking the other way when you see some homophobic or transphobic assault on the street, or not checking in with your neighbors, if you have like a heterosexual couple living next door and you notice that the woman has a black eye, people going homeless, politicians passing laws, raising the prices on food, raising the prices on rent. Those things cause a lot more harm, but the whole discourse around violence is intentionally structured, and it's always been structured to normalize those things, to make it seem like those are okay. So violence really refers to something that's shocking, something that's out of the ordinary, more than it refers to harm, to actually hurting people. So like I mentioned, there's lots of different definitions around violence, but I don't think that that's a debate that's worth having, because if it's violent for us to stop an eviction, if it's violent for us to steal food, when we don't have enough money for it, or to fight back against police when they kill people, to shut down a port, to shut down a factory, or even destroy a factory that's making weapons, if that's violent, so what? So nonviolence has a lot of help making this argument that it's more effective. Somehow, they're able to tell us with these cliches that, nonviolence is revolutionary because we live in a violent society, and therefore, nonviolence is different. And yet every time some hack writes a book about how, nonviolence is better, it's an instant bestseller because it gets all the support from huge capitalist publishing firms. It gets all the support from the media, from progressive media, all the way right up to, center of the road, mainstream capitalist media. It gets the writers get awards, they get interviews on television, and so on and so forth. A great example of this is a lot of the research that's used by Extinction Rebellion to justify their practice of nonviolence and civil disobedience. The main researchers behind these different studies that got plastered all over the news with different percentages and statistics, like nonviolence is 42% more effective, and so on and so forth. Chenoweth and Stefan, one of these worked for the U.S. Defense Department, and then worked a lot longer in the U.S. State Department, including in the embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, supporting the invasion and occupation of that country. So their position to speak about nonviolence is a little bit hypocritical at best. And of course, it should be no surprise that that the U.S. government wants people to be nonviolent when they take the streets, when they resist. It shouldn't be any surprise that there's so much elite support from capitalists, from the media, for nonviolence in our movements. Because they can use whatever tactics they want, they can carpet bomb countries, they can use structural adjustment and austerity to squeeze people dry, to kill people on a massive scale. And those of us who protest that, those of us who try to fight back against it, are supposed to just ask nicely. Ask them to stop, maybe block a street at the very most, but not do much else. So the study that's based on, made by, in part by someone who works for the U.S. government, is based on a really flawed methodology. In order to compare, the effectiveness of nonviolence and violence, they took one group, which was, all of the nonviolent social movements over the last century or so, and then another group that represents, the violent movements. For their nonviolent sample, they took basically lists given to them by proponents of nonviolence. So they basically went up to all of the the academics in favor of nonviolence and asked them to give their 100 greatest hits, right? So these are the examples that are most likely to be well known because proponents of nonviolence believe them to be effective. And then for the other side, the other sample, they didn't go up to any of a great number of critics of nonviolence who participate in social movements. They didn't ask anyone on the opposing side to give examples of movements of, with a diversity of tactics, with a big diversity of different methods of participating. And they didn't even look for any kind of help trying to define what the definition of violence or whatever the opposing pole is to nonviolence, because there isn't really anyone out there who's championing violence versus nonviolence from the other side of things. This is basically a dichotomy that comes completely out of the imaginary of pacifists. What they did instead was they compared it with a list of conflicts with more than 1,000 combat deaths. In other words, wars. Like you have small scale wars that didn't even make it on their list. So this isn't a list of things that anyone is proposing as the ideal way to change things. People who are looking at actual revolutionary social change, they didn't get any input on what should be compared. Things like the banlieue uprising in France in 2005 or the massive insurrection in Greece in 2008 won't even make the list because they didn't get to 1,000 combat deaths. Things like the ZAD in France, which actually accomplished shutting down the construction of a new airport, that's not going to make the list. Standing Rock, shutting down a pipeline on indigenous land in North America, that's not going to make the list. And so on and so forth. In other words, it's a completely manipulative study. It's just nothing short of a cynical excuse to produce statistics, to make big headlines, trusting that no one in the media is actually going to look at this research and how trashy it is, and knowing that they're going to be famous. They're going to get their names published everywhere. It's going to be great for their careers. They're going to win awards. They're going to win hundreds of thousands of dollars. So basically the system rewards people who promote nonviolence. So just for anyone out there who is particularly interested in Extinction Rebellion, it might help to know that all of their scientific research claiming that nonviolence is more effective is fraudulent. Also, it helps to know that a lot of the examples of successful nonviolence were not actually nonviolent. They were actually movements that included riots, that might have even had armed wings, that included great amounts of property destruction and whatnot. And this goes beyond these two pro-system social scientists. This is a habit. This is a long-running habit of proponents of nonviolence. They take conflictive social movements and they completely simplify the history. They erase other forms of participation in that movement. They take something often that was just a partial victory and they portray it as a complete victory. For example, independence from colonialism in India. This was not a peaceful movement. Everyone knows about Gandhi because the state wants you to know about Gandhi. Capitalists want you to know about Gandhi. He's the only one they're going to put in the history books. And so it was certainly important to kick the British out, and like I was mentioning, that's something that was done by a diversity of different groups. There were nonviolent campaigns like the ones organized by Gandhi, which were definitely important. There were also armed groups and revolutionaries. The Indian National Congress at various moments was more supportive of armed struggle than pacifist struggle. There were revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, there were riots, there were assassinations, there were bombings, and so on and so forth. So the British preferred to negotiate with the pacifists. And that's something that Frantz Fanon, the really important anti-colonial theorist from Martinique, who also participated in the independence movement in Algeria, pointed out. That nonviolence is important for the colonial elite to demonstrate that they have control over the independence movement, so they're responsible politicians. So the European powers, the powers of the global north that are trying to control the capitalist system globally, can negotiate with them and can trust them to take over the project. They can give them independence, trusting that India is just going to morph into a neo-colony and it's going to continue with the capitalist project. It's not going to get too radical. So it was an important victory, but it was by no means a total victory. A lot of what the movement was talking about when they were talking about independence also meant independence from the economic system that British colonialism had brought, and that still has not been achieved. So there's this pattern of falsifying very diverse movements and presenting them as nonviolent. A great example of that is the movement against the U.S. war against Vietnam during the 60s and 70s. So the U.S. basically took up where the French colonizers left off and tried to control this transition in Vietnam from colonialism, direct colonialism, to a regime that would still be friendly to European and North American interests. So the U.S. started increasing the number of troops that they had there, military support for the puppet government in South Vietnam, and so on and so forth. Proponents of nonviolence claim this as a victory for nonviolence. They said that when the U.S. finally pulled out in the early mid-70s, it was because of this nonviolent social movement in the U.S. That's an easy claim for them to make in the global north, at least, because the media that we grow up with, the movies and so on and so forth, what they show are huge peaceful protests with hippies giving flowers to soldiers and so forth. They don't show the literally thousands of acts of sabotage that occurred against the U.S. war machine, against military production, especially against recruitment. Recruitment offices on U.S. university campuses were getting bombed at an alarming rate. They don't show the riots or any of that. They only show this peaceful protest. But even more important than that, really central to the question, is the armed resistance by Vietnamese people themselves. There was no U.S. protest movement until Vietnamese people started killing U.S. soldiers. Basically, a fairly accurate generalization is that people in the U.S. didn't give a damn about what was happening in Vietnam until they realized that they faced the danger of getting drafted and getting killed over there. So really there were no effective, active pacifists beyond, just like a couple examples who were protesting the war in Vietnam without the armed resistance of the Vietnamese. So that's the very basis of the entire resistance movement. Secondly, the actual military reason, and you can actually go up and you can look at the discussions, the internal debates that the Pentagon was having, that the U.S. Defense Department was having about strategy in Vietnam. You can read their reasoning, and they actually talk about why they came to the decision to pull U.S. troops out of Vietnam. And that was because U.S. troops had become completely mutinous and were killing their officers. Thousands and thousands of officers were killed by their own soldiers. Many military units went just mutinied and refused to fight. They went on strike. A lot of that was an influence from black and brown liberation movements in the U.S. So you had officers, on their bases, mostly white officers, of course, saluting the soldiers, and the soldiers, instead of saluting in response, would throw up a black power symbol. And they were refusing to fight, and if their officers tried to make them fight, they were just killing those officers. That's the reason that the U.S. military pulled out of Vietnam. And a part of that was because of very militant, combative, anti-racist movements in the U.S., and a part of that was awareness that the Vietnamese people had a right to be free and independent because they were fighting back and because they were killing U.S. troops. So really even the movement in the military was largely created by the armed resistance of the Vietnamese. So really, if you think about it, it's actually quite racist to just completely cut the Vietnamese people out of that whole story of resistance, and to cut out the central role of black and brown liberation movements in the U.S. out of that story, and to center primarily white pacifists in the U.S., hardly taking any risks, taking very, very few risks, and instead engaging in a comfortable protest movement, and then claiming all of the credit for ending the war. I mean, it's completely hypocritical, it's completely wrong, and it's also racist. The funny thing is, pacifists have such a tendency to believe their own lies, they swallow their own propaganda, that in 2003, they actually believed that nonviolent protest movements could end a major war. So in 2003, everyone knew the US, Great Britain, a few other countries, Spain, were getting ready to invade Iraq again and kill a whole bunch of people again for very specific economic and political interests. Different protest organizations around the world, in the UK, in the US, across Europe especially, organized really huge protests before the invasion even happened in March 2003. And it was actually probably the largest day of protest in human history. Millions of people all around the world protested. And unlike all of these other examples, it actually was a peaceful protest movement. There were very, very few cities where there was any rioting or anything like that. The vast majority of those protests were peaceful. So these proponents of nonviolence were believed their own manipulations so much that they predicted, and you can go back and look, they predicted after those protests that the war had been averted, that now it would be impossible for the US and the UK, etc., to invade Iraq because so much people power had manifested in the streets. It would just be impossible. We know how that ended up. They were completely wrong. The US invaded. More than 1 million people have been killed. And it's just disgusting, this level of ideological complicity where people in the global north convince ourselves that we can adopt pretty much the most comfortable form of protest possible, and then we can be the saviors for people in other parts of the world. It doesn't work like that. It's a bunch of bullshit, and we've known that it's bullshit for a long time, but proponents of nonviolence, they keep choosing to be rewarded by the system. They keep choosing to publish the books that will get them bestsellers, that will make them lots of money, that will win them awards, that will get them in the media, and that will give them overall a friendly relationship with the very institutions of power that supposedly we're fighting against. So that's nonviolence in a nutshell. That's some of the patterns that it historically engages in order to claim to be effective. We can see lots of connections between proponents of nonviolence and the state and capitalists. One of the most prominent theorists of nonviolence today is Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp's doctoral research on nonviolent regime change was actually funded by the U.S. Defense Department, and his protege in really what was one of the the chief and prototypical color revolutions, the bulldozer revolution in Serbia, actually worked for Stratfor, a major private security company with a close relationship with the U.S. Defense Department, and they described this nonviolent methodology as being like a carrier group, as being a great method for regime change in U.S. interests. So for those of you who don't know, the color revolutions were a series of overwhelmingly nonviolent revolutions that happened in states close to Russia. Serbia, there was a failed one in Belarus, several in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, Lebanon. The one in Ukraine was referred to as the Orange Revolution. So we have like the Orange Revolution, Lilac Revolution, Rose Revolution. So a lot of them were named after colors because they were based on a very simplistic marketing scheme, right? No deep debate, no analysis of what's actually going wrong in a society, simply capitalizing on widespread public discontent in order to get people into the streets like sheep, without having any agency over what direction the movement took, in order to provoke an electoral crisis. So the Orange Revolution in Ukraine was really typical. There was an election. They disputed the results of the election. It was called the Orange Revolution because they asked everyone to wear the color orange. The slogan was tak, which means yes. They had no deeper discourse. Like in the same movement, you had everyone from like socialists to neo-Nazis. Debate was avoided because they knew that the movement would fall apart. It was like we might say in the US like an astroturf movement, artificial, created from above. It got a lot of funding from the European Union, from the US government. And in the end, they were able to create this electoral crisis and get the pro-Russia government to step down. And instead, you had a pro-European Union, pro-US government step up. And within a year, that government had the same disapproval ratings as the old government. They also had their own corruption scandals. Nothing had changed. A couple of interesting things about these color revolutions, aside from what I already pointed out, that they were heavily supported by the US government, and they didn't lead to any fundamental social transformation or even any real questioning of what was wrong in society that caused all these people to be precarious or disempowered or angry. Proponents of nonviolence will always talk in these kind of mystical terms that, if you use violence, you lose legitimacy, or, nonviolence has this almost magical capacity to work better. There were a couple of revolutions where the professional activist organizations trying to control them actually didn't have control. And those revolutions actually went down pretty much the same way as the other ones. So really the question is not necessarily what tactics do people use, it's, where are they actually aiming their critiques? Are they trying to create anything different, or are they just trying to replace one government with another? Some governments have been gotten rid of with peaceful protests. Other governments were gotten rid of by major riots and had, the president had to flee in a helicopter. And it actually didn't make any difference in how things played out over the next months and years. And then another thing is none of those movements have ever been able to withstand full state repression. If the government decides to use the full force of the police against the movement, or if they send in the military. So actually Gene Sharp developed this method for use in Burma against the dictatorship there, and it completely failed. The last time that there was a peaceful popular uprising against the government in Burma, the military put it down very easily, and the time before that, and the time before that. You only saw some kind of regime change in Burma after major US corporations and European corporations that invest in Burma started pressuring them to shift to democracy. And what did you see then? The military actually didn't lose a lot of power in Burmese society, but they did permit elections. They did let Aung San Suu Kyi come into office, this hero of nonviolence, and she ended up supporting the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar. So, there's this like absolute superficiality. There's this complicity with state power, complicity with some of the worst exercises of state power, like genocide, and it's all justified in very superficial terms, like as though a democracy weren't also capable of doing really terrible things. There's really this superficial politics at the heart of nonviolence. In the last couple minutes that I have, I want to talk a little bit about a diversity of tactics. A diversity of tactics just means that you accept that you can't control an entire movement. You don't try to be authoritarian and work with the police or the media to delegitimize or to arrest the people you disagree with. You look for ways that different methods and different tactics can complement one another, can work together, and sometimes you just can't work together and there's going to be conflict, but that's all right. You're not trying to dominate the whole movement. So diversity of tactics talks more about how you can be effective in the streets. So for example, taking over space and defending space. And that's really, really important, because if you look at some of the movements that have actually won substantial victories in the last years, or created or at least begun processes of radical social change, these are all movements that were able to seize space. That's something that a peaceful movement can't do. If the police decide to evict a peaceful crowd from the streets or from a plaza or a park, they're going to be able to do it. It's only when people fight back that the police sometimes meet their match, and people are able to stay in the street, they're able to stay in public space and start transforming it. By disrupting normality, by holding assemblies, debates, and so on and so forth, or by directly preventing, for example, some kind of infrastructural project, something like that. So that's the example of the ZAD in France, where they actually prevented an airport from being constructed using very combative methods, but also a diversity of methods, different kinds of methods, from communication to barricades to rioting. And then you also have the George Floyd revolt in the United States, where questions about abolishing the police have actually been made into a mainstream conversation and a debate that normal people are having in their everyday life because of the ferociousness of this movement, which started out with people burning down a police station. When that police station got burnt down, they actually did a poll, and burning down the police station was more popular than either Biden or Trump at that moment. Also in the U.S., police were never arrested and charged with murdering people until the riots started. It's only in the last 10 years, really with the Oscar Grant riots in California, that you see police starting to be held accountable for murdering people. And obviously that's not anarchist goal. We're not going to be comfortable with just okay, well, police will go to prison if they ever murder someone. Obviously we want to abolish police. Police getting held accountable is the first step to that, and now as we've seen, the actual question of abolishing police is on the table in such a conservative law and order society like the United States. And that is a direct result of people fighting back with everything they have, and also looking for ways to use other tactics. So in these same movements, you find spaces for debate, spaces for conversation, spaces for people taking care of one another. Also, being in the streets in a combative way requires you to think about care, think about taking care of one another, legal support, having medics, treating people who've been run over by cars, driven by fascists, treating people who've been shot by cops, and so on and so forth. So really in an effective movement, it's not just about the tactics, it's also very important to have radical goals, to have a radical horizon and an imaginary of a completely different world. For example, one with no police, one in which we're taking ecological catastrophe seriously. And it's also necessary to have a diversity of tactics to enable the full range of activities that you need in a healthy movement, which means ultimately we need to envision our movements as a sort of ecosystem in which, no one is ever going to be, all the same. We're not going to be clones of one another, and that's actually a good thing. We're not all going to be using the same tactics, but we can think of ourselves each as sort of a different species within this movement, and we're trying to find our niche and trying to help create a niche for others where they can be stronger, where they can be more effective, and all together we can transform this shitty capitalist statist world into one that's actually worth living in. So I've gone over my time a little bit. Thank you so much for listening, and also thanks to the folks there in Finland for organizing this. Keep fighting. All the best.